Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, good evening to the Baker Institute, to this special program. I'm delighted to introduce a friend and a person I respect a great deal, Jack Kemp, the co-director of Empower America, which is a public policy and advocacy organization he co-founded in '93 with William Bennett and Jean Kirkpatrick. You all know about, and I know many of Jack's friends are here tonight, so I'm not going to go through a lengthy CV. Throughout his career, Jack has been one of our nation's leading advocates for strong economic growth, free markets, free trade, and tax simplification, and lower tax rates on both work and investment. He is also the first and strongest advocate for revitalizing our cities by establishing, you will remember, the enterprise zones to encourage entrepreneurship and job creation in urban America, and expanding home ownership amongst low-income people through resident management and ownership of public housing. In 1996, Jack gained even further prominence in the national spotlight when Senator Bob Dole named him as the Republican Party's vice presidential candidate. The nomination was testimony to Jack Kemp's impact on the tax and economic debate for the '96 campaign through his role as chairman of the National Commission on Economic Growth and Tax Reform. Now, prior to founding Empower America, Jack Kemp served for 4 years as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and proved to be one of our nation's most innovative leaders in that role. Before his appointment to the cabinet, Jack represented the Buffalo area and Western New York for 18 years in the United States House of Representatives. Most importantly, given this weekend in Houston, Jack spent 13 years in professional football, playing quarterback for the San Diego Chargers and the Buffalo Bills. He led the Buffalo Bills to the American Football League championship in 1964 and 1965 when he was named the league's most valuable player. He also founded the AFL Players Association and was elected president for 5 terms. Jack is a sports hero in our country, but he's also made that tremendous transition from being a jock to going into politics. And he's done it in an exemplary way. He's one of the most charming politicians and sportsmen we have. He was one of our first speakers at the Baker Institute in 1996 when we just started out and had our first conference, and he gave a brilliant presentation on tax policy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Jack Kemp to the podium.
No, sit down. It's not a... Thank you. Thank you. So kind of you. Don't be nervous. This is not my speech today. These are props. Ambassador, thank you so very much for that very gracious introduction. Ed and I have become good friends, as the Bakers are good friends of the Kemps, and I appreciate your tremendous contribution. I don't think there's anyone who understands the Middle East more than Ed Jarisian, and I'm highly flattered and honored. You may wonder how he got me here. He called me about 3 weeks ago. He knew the Super Bowl was coming up. He said, "Kemp, do you believe in free speech?" I said, "Well, Mr. Ambassador, I worship at the shrine of our First Amendment. Of course I believe in free speech. Why do you ask?" He said, "Will you give one at the Baker Institute?" This is not a lecture. It's just a talk. Informal, hopefully, some questions. And Ed and I are going to sit up here later and take on one of the most difficult and challenging topics for America in the 21st century. How do we as a nation relate to the Islamic Muslim, and Arab world, particularly as tonight our young men and women are on the ground in harm's way in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other parts of that region. I must pay tribute not only to you, Ed, but to Jimmy Baker. Baker and I served together in the President Bush I cabinet. He accused me of conducting foreign policy as Secretary of Housing. I told him somebody's got to do it. Of course, he shot back at me and said, when Bush picked Kemp, he got 10 cabinet secretaries in one. So you don't get to top Jimmy Baker. But I seriously am grateful that it's under his aegis and auspices, which I speak on this very important topic of a 21st century Marshall Aid Plan. And I am humbled by the fact that the architect of that plan was Will Clayton, a businessman from Houston who went to Washington under the auspices of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a Democrat, maybe a very centrist right Democrat to serve our country. He literally changed the face of Europe. I can't say single-handedly, but there were a lot of other people involved. But his great-grandson is here today, and I would like for you to meet Will Garwood, the great-grandson of the great businessman from Houston, Texas, who changed, I think, the Marshall Aid Plan into what it became, Will Garwood himself. My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm equally humbled that the former ambassador from Iran, Persia, to the United States in the 60s and 70s, Hushang Ansari, is here with his lovely wife, Shala. Mr. Ambassador, you would honor me to stand up and let us recognize one of the great friends of the United States. Shala, thank you for being here, dear friends of the Kemps, and a legend in newspaper business, journalism, and politics. Mr. Nixon's press secretary, communications director of the White House for President Nixon, 2 terms, a dear friend of mine from San Diego. In fact, he hired me when I was quarterback of the Chargers. Gave me a job, which I sadly needed in those days. I made $11,500 as quarterback of the San Diego Chargers. They thought I was overpaid. I played my first game in Houston at Jefferson Stadium. The next year, we played in Rice Stadium. So this is one of many visits to Rice University. I'd like you to meet someone upon whose shoulders I stand, a dear friend of the Kemps, Herb Klein of the San Diego Union, San Diego, California. In fact, he had a lot to do with getting the Super Bowl in San Diego. So this is Joanne Kemp's 37th Super Bowl. So the only woman in Western civilization who's the wife and mother of 3 professional football quarterbacks, my wife, Joanne Kemp. Joanne, stand up. It's a long time to get me from football to politics, you know. You may be wondering how I did it. It's quite easy. I spent 13 years in quarterbacking and professional football, broke both ankles, both shoulders, my right knee, my right hand, and had 11 concussions. Nothing left to do but go into politics and run for Congress. Ed, I want to thank you for one other thing. I've been traveling recently with my partner, Bill Hickman, who's here, and his lovely wife, and been to Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Kuwait, Egypt, Morocco. I want to thank you for the study that you have done. He's presenting this to the United States Congress next week in front of the House Appropriations Committee. I think one of the most important contributions to understanding between the United States and the Middle East, between the United States and the Muslim world, changing minds and winning the peace. Because what this says is we are in a battle of ideas. Clearly, it is a military side to it, but clearly, just as clearly, there is a battle of ideas going on today here and around the world over what to do, how to approach the Middle East, how to approach the region. What do we do about living a a peaceful living modus vivendi, I should say, between Israel and Palestine. What are we going to do about Iraq and Afghanistan, Central Asia? So it is to that topic I wish to speak tonight, and then open it up for your questions. First of all, the macro. There would not have been a Marshall Plan in 1947/48 without Will Clayton, to whom I have such high regard and respect. Will Clayton was a businessman, came from this city, went to Washington under Roosevelt. He actually knew Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and became a very good friend of both Roosevelt and Truman. I won't tell the story at length, but I will tell you that it was his memorandum to Secretary of State General George Marshall that laid out the predicate for what we now call the Marshall Plan. Now, parenthetically speaking, there is some confusion about what it was. Some people think it was a worldwide soup kitchen, just handing out and shoveling out foreign aid to Western Europe circa 1948. Not so. But on the other hand, the libertarian right wing believe that there was no aid needed for Western Europe. That too is a falsity. Aid was needed, but Will Clayton believed in trade. Trade plus aid plus monetary reform plus private property became the predicate of what we now call the West European and West German economic miracle, of which I'm very familiar because Joanne and I have been to Germany many times, lecturing in different parts of that country on Ludwig Erhard and the Wirtschaftswunder. I don't speak German, but I've learned that word, which means an economic miracle. It was not a miracle. The recovery of West Germany was not a miracle at all. It was predicated on the 18th century liberal enlightened ideas of Adam Smith, who was not a professor of economics. He was a professor of moral theology at Glasgow University circa 1770 to 1776. In fact, his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations, was published in the same year, in the same summer, in the same month as Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. How is it possible that two men on the opposite sides of the Atlantic, one from Glasgow, Scotland, one a child of the Enlightenment in the United States, Virginia, could author the two of the greatest political and economic treatises ever laid out for mankind? The Declaration that we're all equal, endowed by a creator with inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and property. Well, actually said the pursuit of happiness. But in those days, the pursuit of happiness meant that you had a right to own property. You had a right to control your own destiny. And that idea came because of the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment. Smith, the professor of moral philosophy, had authored a book on moral sentiments. But then in 1776, in July, was published An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations. Not white nations, not heterogeneous nations, not European nations, not nations with lots of resources. His book was that any nation, big or small, in bad climates or good climates, with resources or no resources, could create wealth if they did certain things. Traded freely, had sound money, money that held its value over time, had a tax regime that was relatively simple and low on the formation of capital and labor, on the radical theory that you can't create labor without capital being invested. I say this at a parenthetical point because my papa was a truck driver. We owned our house. He made a radical decision in 1944-45 to mortgage the house, borrow money, leverage what was up until then dead capital into live capital, and bought the truck. When I go on college campuses to speak, I tell young people, capitalism is not based on greed. Papa Kemp was not greedy. He just had 4 boys he wanted to put through college, and he decided the very best way he could do it was to buy a truck and start a trucking company. It's also based on audacity. Dr. King, at the Nobel Prize winning speech he gave in Oslo, when he won the Nobel Prize, gave a speech in Oslo in which he said, I have an abiding faith in America, but I have an audacious faith in mankind. What a great thought. I love that word, audacious, because my daddy, with one truck, driving the truck, loading the truck, CEO, CFO, CTO, CIO, labor management, with my mother keeping the books, called that one trucking company in Los Angeles, California in 1945, the California Delivery Service. That's audacity, or chutzpah. Made a profit. Did not buy my mother a fur coat. He took that profit and bought a second truck and hired a truck driver to drive that second truck. My first lesson in economics was from my dad. Truck drivers' wages are higher when they've got trucks to drive than when they don't. A priori, to us, but we take it for granted. The capital and labor had to come together to form a new job. I told Richard Gebhardt one time, you cannot create employees without first creating employers. The essence of entrepreneur capitalism is bringing labor and capital together. And in our debate before the Urban League, Richard Gebhardt said, well, there goes Jack Kemp again, cutting the capital gain tax, a typical Republican. And Bush has taken the same type of shots from Kerry and Dean. Excuse me, I'm not turning this into a political arena because Jim wouldn't like that. But they're all attacking the president for cutting the tax rate on dividends and capital gains and income, both on labor and capital. And when Gebhardt attacked me for cutting the capital gains tax and calling me another Republican going for the investor, he represented labor, he represented the worker. I said, Richard, you're making a basic mistake. The worker and the investor are not two separate peoples at opposite ends of the political spectrum. They're the very same people, but at different stages of their life. You work to save, you save to invest, and you invest in order to build that business for yourself, your family, your children, and your community that we celebrate as capitalism, but it really is the only way out of the poverty trap into which so many third world countries we have visited are caught up in. I don't mean to be pedantic about this, but to take Will Clayton, what he did in Western Europe in 1947, gave to Marshall. Marshall gave that speech at Harvard that came to be known as the Marshall Plan, was predicated on very simple yet profound Smithian ideas. Sound money. In 1948, the cigarette, the American cigarette, Chesterfield cigarettes, Camel cigarettes, Lucky Strike cigarettes were the basic money of West Germany. People were wandering around Berlin, wandering around West Germany, using cigarettes as a monetary unit of account. A man by the name of Ludwig Erhard, a little-known economist from Freiburg University, established the Deutsche Mark, tied it to the dollar, which was tied to that four-letter word, gold. 1 ounce was worth $35 an ounce. And we had something called GATT, which was also the architect was Will Clayton of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that opened up trade for Western Europe. And as France and Germany, who hated each other all throughout the 20th century, they then became each other's biggest trading partner. Trade. Sound money. Erhard cut the tax rate. Get ready for this. The tax on $500 DM was over 60%. He didn't cut the rate. He took the $500 threshold at which you reach the 60% bracket and raised it to $50,000 DM. That is a tax cut. I love to quote John F. Kennedy because it drives the family crazy. I don't mean that to be nasty. I just mean Teddy just gets very upset if anybody quotes John F. Kennedy other than him or his family. And I told Ronald Reagan, this is wearing it on my sleeve, I apologize, but I gave Reagan one of the great quotes of the 1980 campaign. Kennedy said, a paradoxical truth, high tax rates cause low tax revenues, and the very best way to get more revenue is to cut the rates and expand the economy. That became the essence of what we now call supply-side economics. Hard money, low taxes, less regulation, and private property. Erhard called his economic philosophy a Sozialmarktwirtschaft, a socially responsible market economy, market-oriented economy with a human face. What George Bush calls compassionate conservatism, and I called bleeding heart conservatism, was simply making sure you had a net under which people should not be allowed to fall, but a ladder of opportunity upon which all people could climb. West Germany's recovery was so astounding, they cut tax rates every year for 6 years. The same thing happened in Japan with General Douglas MacArthur. Land reform, private property, they did it without disrupting the culture of the Japanese. And today, Germany and Japan are democratic. Guess what people said in 1947 and 48? It will never work. They don't have a tradition of democracy. The same things are being said today about the Middle East. Democracy can never take place in Iraq, can never take place in Afghanistan, can never take place in Lebanon, where you were our ambassador. Were you not, Ed? Syria. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I truly believe that Benito Juarez was right in the century of the Mexican Revolution when he said, democracy is the ultimate destiny of all mankind. And I think that's the approach the Bush administration is trying to take. Pragmatically, it's going to take a lot of effort. Will it take aid? Absolutely. Will it take opening up our trade? Absolutely. Should we eliminate our tariffs on steel? Absolutely. Maybe do it over 2 or 3 years, but they've got to come down. Should we stop farming subsidies? So subsidized farming in the United States is hurting the Middle East, hurting Central Asia, hurting Africa. Having been in Nigeria, Bill, you and I just last summer, our subsidies in cotton and agriculture are absolutely destroying the market for African farmers and agriculture. Now, can we do it? I believe we can. It's going to take leadership. And I believe that with you, Ed, with Jimmy Baker relieving the debt, he is the modern day Will Clayton. Let me say this at the Baker Institute. I believe that Jim Baker running, and it is running, to leave his home, to go to Europe and talk to the French and talk to the Germans and talk to the Russians and talk to Canada and talk to other countries. Even, as I understand it, Serbia is owed $2 or $3 billion from Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They should be eliminated, as Will Clayton did in West Europe in 1946, 47, and 48, getting European countries debt relief so that the United States could see this recovery take place. I think it's an exciting time. It is a tremendous challenge. But as I said earlier, it is not based on just giving aid, albeit that is needed to be mindful of the fact that people have to eat, there has to be medicine, there has to be short-term political and financial help. But in the long run, we have to open our markets, take down our tariffs. Our tariffs on Afghanistan textiles, our tariffs on Pakistan textiles are 60% higher than they are on steel. So third world countries are in desperate need to be able to trade in the United States market. Tax reform, I was glad to see Putin in Russia take the top rate from 73 down to 13. They have a flat tax in Russia, and the stock market has grown 700%. The stock market is not the only thing that matters, but it is an indicator that entrepreneurship is taking place. I mentioned Smith. I'll close with Smith. He said something in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations, that I've never forgotten. He said, the desire to improve our lot in life comes to us out of the womb of our mothers and never leaves until the day we die. There isn't a man or woman born on this planet who doesn't want the same thing for their children that you want for yours, that doesn't want the same thing for their legacy as we want for ours. Do we make mistakes? Absolutely. Have we made some mistakes in Iraq? Absolutely. Firing 400,000 Iraqi army men and women in uniform was putting them on the street, unemployed, without any money, with the anger that has been disseminated, was a mistake. We're now hiring them back. We learn from those mistakes, but we're a country that has always been willing to look inward at those mistakes and correct them. And I just want to say, Will Garwood, your great-grandfather is a great inspiration to this generation of men and women who want to make a difference, not just in Western Europe, but this time in the Middle East, because we've got to get it right. We have to do it without disrupting their culture. We have to do it with a way of respecting their tradition, respecting the religion. But the Holy Quran defends private property, defends trade. The Prophet Muhammad was a trader. He was a merchant. So was his wife. I think there are some ways of reaching people and reaching out to people and beginning to listen And I want to thank you, Ed, again, for this tremendous contribution to changing minds and winning the peace, because the alternative is unacceptable in the 21st century. Thank you. As a postscript, I can't pass this out, but I would like to. Oh, Berdine Johnson. Where's Berdine? Berdine Johnson is the granddaughter of Will Clayton. I'm so happy to meet you. You must have a beautiful grandmother.
Very outspoken, just as he was very modest. And if Molly Hip had not given you my name, I was going to thank you for acknowledging all of Will Clayton's accomplishments. And tell you that I also am one of his grandchildren, and my name is Berdine Clayton Johnson.
Oh, Berdine, that's fabulous. Yeah. Every one of you is important, but it's just. Oh, I want to introduce a dear friend who's from Houston, and is President Bush's choice to be the chair of the U.S. Holocaust Commission and one of the hosts for the weekend for the Kemps. Fred Zeidman of Houston. Fred, stand up. Thank you. Last little point. My colleague on this 21st Century Marshall Aid Plan is Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, the author of El Otro Sendero, which in Spanish means the other path. Because not so long ago, the shining path, the Marxist terrorist movement in Peru, was gaining ascendancy, and 90% of the Peruvian economy was under the table, was unregistered. And he did a study of the Peruvian economy, turned the government around. They registered property. They turned contracts into legality. People got title to their property. Today, the shining path is off in the forest of the hills, and the other path has been moved by Peru. That's what he's doing for Egypt, because 85% of the Egyptian economy is informal, unregistered, and they get no tax revenue. So the mistake of the socialist command and control policies of many developing countries was to raise taxes. We're not getting enough tax revenue? Raise taxes. Well, unfortunately, that paradoxical Kennedy position came in: the higher the tax, the less the revenue, more people under the table. This is that study, and I report to you from having just been in Cairo with the finance minister of Egypt and the prime minister of Egypt, Abeid. They are going to conduct radical surgery on the Egyptian economy and begin the process of registering their economy. If we can do it in Egypt, we can do it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and maybe, hopefully, in our lifetime, turn the Muslim world to represent that which we know it can represent, the potential, that human potential that George Bush talked about when he called for a free trade zone for the Middle East. Ambassador, you want to join me for the... Thank you for letting us pontificate before the Super Bowl Sunday. I'm not going to ask you all for who you're for, but I'm an old AFL guy, right, Herb?
Jack has agreed to have a discussion, very informal, and any comments or questions from the audience, and we can discuss. No football questions. And we will entertain any of the ideas or discussions or comments that you want to make, and talk about not only the themes that Jack presented, but the whole issue of Marshall Plan in the Middle East and the whole potential for economic and political reform. So just raise your hands and wait for the our staff who have microphones, and speak to the microphone, please.
Jack, as you know, I've read your Marshall Plan, and I think it's very unique. I think it would be good for the audience if you could just briefly outline the plan to bring small illegal business into legality and help the economy in those countries.
Well, I would hope, when we present this to the White House in a couple weeks, that Colin Powell or Dick Cheney or Condi Rice or Bob Zelnick could convince the Iraqi Governing Council to allow for a quick study of the informal economy of Iraq. We all know Iraq has huge potential. They are people who are educated, entrepreneurial, want the best for their future. I had lunch last week with the Kurdish Prime Minister, and I'm absolutely convinced that there is more good news, but unfortunately is being drowned out by this tar baby that keeps, punching back at us through insurgents. My hope would be that we could take the underground economy, convince the governing council, and create a sovereign Iraq as soon as possible. Obviously, the U.S. military has to stay until the job is done. Can't cut and run. That they would do a study with Hernando de Soto that would give them a chance to begin the process of registering. And we all know, in my opinion, well, we don't all know, that those oil reserves, and I would bow to the wisdom of Hushang Ansari, Ambassador Ansari, on this issue, but I would hope that the oil industry would be privatized. It would be broken up into oil companies. Iraqi control those companies and give the Iraqi people share stock in those oil companies so they have a stake in the future of that industry. Because if it's privatized and it's bought by Shell or bought by BP or bought by Chevron or bought by U.S., I fear that they would think that we were there simply to get our hands on Iraqi oil. I think that would be a tragedy. I think that would be a tragedy for the United States of America. So this guy De Soto is, if you've never heard of him, his other book is The Mystery of Capital. The Mystery of Capital. It's in the hands of 62 African and Arab-led nations, and it is basically helping people recognize that when you have title to property, you can turn dead capital into live capital, and you can create those enterprises that are so important that we just take for granted, being Americans, knowing that our mom and dad owns that property, and we can leverage it into investment.
I'd like to ask Hushang Ansari if he has a comment. Hushang Ansari, who headed the Iranian National Oil Company and then later made such a successful career in the energy business. Hushang, do you have a comment on that?
I'd like to applaud Jack for this wonderful initiative at a time when the naysayers are talking about the inability of the Iraqi people to democratize, the inability of Middle Easterners to take the initiative of creating an enterprise system that's based on freedom of choice, on the ability of the human individual to maximize the benefits of all that is at his disposal. I grew up in Japan in post-war period under American occupation, where the military regime was changed through the initiative and support of the American people under the leadership of General MacArthur, a military man who was the last person on earth regarded as a man who was qualified to introduce the principles of democracy. And what happened in a country like Japan? Democracy came in its best form, supported by the resources and the advice and the wisdom of the American leadership. And as a result of that initiative, the economy in Japan turned around on the basis of principles of free enterprise system. In the first 16 years after the end of the Pacific War, the price of every stock that was listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, small or large or medium, jumped 10,000 times. In other words, if you had put in $10,000 by the average man, within 16 years, you would have $100 million. And that's the way Japan became a truly democratic nation. A nation that had no natural resource, and to this day imports up to 95% of its needs. Now take a look at Iraq and see its tremendous gas and oil reserves, see its other natural resources, and see the desire, the hunger on the part of its people to welcome the initiative that the President of the United States has started, putting our children, our men and women in harm's way in support and in the pursuit of a very worthwhile cause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, lady here. Right here? Yes, could you wait for the microphone, please, and identify yourself? Yes. Thank you.
Hello and shalom. I'm Sophia Purchase
Shalom.
with the Consulate General of Israel. And first, I'm proud as a child of Mexican immigrants that you quoted Benito Juarez, who also said, El derecho al respeto ajeno es la paz. The right to self-worth and ownership equals peace. Mm-hmm. But back to Israel. Israel's greatest resource is her brain power, with a lot of highly trained people. We don't have oil, and we have the wonderful technology in every area. What are we doing as Americans in this new Middle East plan regarding the education of such large populations in the Middle East, and especially of women, so that we don't only rely on oil, we rely on brains?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I hate to keep dropping names, but my colleague and I were in Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Kuwait, Morocco, and Cairo. Interesting to me, the talks that we had with King Abdullah of Jordan. He's hosting an Israel-Jordan trade talk in early March. He'll be there. I don't know if Sharon will be there. But high-ranking Israeli officials will be working on a trade pact between Jordan and Israel. Breakthrough. The UAE has a trade desk for Israel. Education of women. In Kuwait, I was absolutely blown away. The largest investment bank in Kuwait, a global investment house, run by a brilliant young Kuwaiti woman, a Muslim, absolutely dynamite entrepreneur, impresaria. Problems abound. I don't want to sweep them under the rug. But things are happening in the Middle East and Africa, the likes of which we have not seen in our part of the world in a long time. The leadership of African countries, Museveni in Uganda, Mbeki in South Africa, Wade in Senegal, Kufuor in Ghana. Open, liberal, in the classical liberal use of the word. Liberal, to be free, to be open, to be generous, to ideas, to women's rights, to property rights. Now, there are many, many problems that still occur, and there's still hatred, but those hatreds, I think, can be ameliorated as people begin to think about the possibility of introducing hope and property and jobs and education and a better life, because those incentives are absolutely juxtaposed against people teaching exactly the opposite. That's why this battle of ideas that Ed and Jimmy Baker are in the middle of, and now I'm in the middle of it with my colleague Hernando de Soto, kind of energizes me here at the beginning of the 21st century to travel as much as I do and to keep minds open and to support Ed in his important work. And I appreciate your question very much.
I would like to comment. I just came back a couple of weeks ago from an important conference in Doha, Qatar, in which it was on U.S.-Muslim dialogue. And at that conference were Muslims from Indonesia, Malaysia, the whole Middle East, the Maghreb. There were Israelis there. It was Europeans, Nigerians, Senegalese. It was truly an international forum looking at all these subjects that we're discussing, not only the dialogue, but also the factor of economic, political reforms and the necessity of these reforms. And some very interesting things are happening in the Middle East. If you look at Qatar itself, the municipal elections, the university, the educational reforms that are going on at that country are remarkable. In Kuwait, the National Assembly, you go down the Gulf to Oman. Even in Saudi Arabia, in which there's such a fixation in our country on the needs for reform in Saudi Arabia, there are the beginnings of reform by Crown Prince Abdullah that need to be encouraged. There are a lot of problems in Saudi Arabia, but the reform movement throughout the Middle East is beginning. It's late in coming, but it's beginning.
reform is no longer an oxymoron in the
Right.
developing world.
I was a little confused by, you're talking about a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. I didn't know whether it was something already proposed or whatever. I gather that it's a proposal that you're making to the president, and it's not so much, when I hear Marshall Plan, I'm 70 years old, so I was alive when it was going on.
You're a young man.
My vision was it was us sending money over there, investing over there, helping them build up their infrastructure again, and the aspect of exporting Adam Smith's ideas, underlying all of that, escaped me. You know, it wasn't that
Well,
and
okay.
so I gather what you're really proposing for the Middle East isn't us sending a lot of money over there. It's us sending our ideas over there, or Adam Smith's ideas, and showing them how, if they implement them, they can be wealthy and they don't have to put up with
Well said.
putting up.
You said in 30 seconds what it took me 30 minutes to say. No, absolutely. Aid is essential. President Bush has wisely asked the Congress for $87 billion over 3 years, and I'm a conservative, but I support that because they need infrastructure, they need education, they need roads. The road from Kabul to Kandahar is yet to be paved. I think it is an investment by the United States in helping keeping the Taliban out of a modern Afghanistan to help Afghanistan rebuild its infrastructure. But on the other hand, Afghan wants to trade with us. The Afghanis want to trade with us. So does Iraq. Those countries need trade. And I'll tell you what I do. This is really radical, and you probably won't support this. But I believe for 10 years or maybe even 7 years, all profits can be repatriated from investments in Iraq and the Middle East and Africa, tax-free. Tax-free. You want to get a flow of capital going to Africa and the Middle East? Allow people to invest and repatriate their profits. Not the oil companies. I'm not anti-energy. I just don't think they need the same incentive that the entrepreneurs and the investors. Capitalism, we have to show that capitalism can be democratized.
Jack, could you expound a little on the informal economy that is such an important part? Because I think that needs to be understood. I was telling Jack when Francoise and I were in the Soviet Union, 25% of the Soviet economy was what the Russians called nalieva. It was on the side. It was the black market economy. And the Soviets, the great advocates of communism and socialism, knew that they couldn't survive without allowing a private market economy to really flourish. They couldn't meet consumer demands without having that element. So if you could explain that a little, I think it'd be
I wish I
very
had the
helpful.
picture. It takes 500 days to start a business. You have to go through 56 government agencies. You have to meet 265 separate regulations to open a bakery in Cairo. I told the story, I'm sure you will remember Luis Muñoz Marin, the governor of Puerto Rico. He came to power under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. He was a socialist professor at the University of San Juan, Puerto Rico. He said, when I was a socialist sitting in an ivory tower, I believed that we had to have a bakery to create bread, and everybody could get an equal distribution of the loaf of bread. But when I became the governor of Puerto Rico, I realized we got to create bakeries. We got to create entrepreneurs. And he introduced Operation Bootstrap, which then became the industrialization of Puerto Rico, predicated upon tax incentives for people to move their capital into Puerto Rico. So he went from socialism to capitalism simply because pragmatically he had to create bakeries. But in Cairo, Egypt, it takes 500 days plus and 270 regulations and 56 government agencies to start a bakery. Papa Kemp would have been, if he were in Cairo, he would be in the underground economy. Why would you register your company? Why would you pay a tax at 70%? That's all Kennedy was saying, at 70%, or Laffer. He said at 70%, you get no tax revenue. Now, we don't think you can't go to zero because there's no tax revenue at zero. The purpose of leadership is to find the level of equilibrium at which people are willing to maximize their output and still pay their tax. And I don't know what you think, but I think it's closer to 20 than to 50 or 60 or 70. This is the developing world, Africa and Middle East, biggest problem right now, unregistered property, people living in huts. Colin Powell said the people of the third world are living on $2 a day. They're not living on $2 a day. The people of the world are working. They've got farm equipment. They've got tools. They're squatting on land. It's just that it's unregistered. So if you register it, they can leverage that property into capital. And that's what Ambassador Ansari was talking about, because MacArthur broke up the feudal landowning system of Japan, redistributed the property. And I'm for redistribution of land if you pay the property owner with real bonds, with real money. And the problem in Vietnam was they reformed the land without paying the landowner, and you end up with death squads. Same thing in El Salvador. Roberto d'Aubisson came to power in El Salvador, or the death squad guy, d'Aubisson. Was that El Salvador? I think it was. But anyway. Nicaragua? No. Ortega. Or d'Aubisson, he was a landowner, and they paid him for over 20 years with bonds that were worth absolutely nothing. But if you pay people, as we did in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, you can end up with a distribution of land where people feel like they have a stake in the democratic system. Excuse me for getting so excited about this.
Okay, lady. The sun.
Yeah, please.
Could you just wait quickly for the, thank you.
I really enjoyed your speech. Thank you. With such energy, I'm sure that your plan will be so successful. You spoke about the clash of ideas, and I was wondering about the clash of cultures. For instance, to so many of the people in the Muslim world, what does it really mean, capitalism, when they see how successful our system is with the drug use and the teenage pregnancy and the disregard for women, the level of abuse, child abuse, all of the things that I'm not really associating it with capitalism, but it's definitely, you can see where they would draw that, they would track that and say, well, why would we want to bring that? We want the property.
That's part of the problem.
And all of those things, but we certainly don't want the problems.
That is very much a part of the problem. It's almost a Dickens-like conundrum. It's the best of times and the worst of times, side by side, in terms of challenges. Samuel Huntington, there's two great books out, both of which I've read, I hope you've read. Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilization and The End of History by Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama has come to the Hegelian conclusion that there'll still be history, but it's the end of history in terms of the clash of ideas, in that democratic capitalism is the only way to function in a modern 21st century world. Samuel Huntington goes to the conclusion that this is a clash of civilizations, that the Islamic world and the Western world cannot ever get along with each other, and this is a war either within Islam or between Islam and the Judeo-Christian West. I refuse to believe that. I am not a student of the Quran, but I've read enough of the writings of the Prophet, and I've seen enough of the Quran to think, or to believe anyway, that it's a defense of values, defense of morality, defense of private property, a defense of sound money, trade. I told you earlier the Prophet Muhammad was a trader. He was a merchant. He married a merchant. They were businessmen and women. The Iraqis are businessmen. This young man, the former ambassador from Persia to the United States, will tell you, in Iran, you are talking to some of the greatest business women and men in the world. So I do believe it is the destiny of all mankind, and I refuse to give up on the idea that people, once they see their democratic rights being allowed to flourish, will ultimately come to that conclusion, notwithstanding the cyberspace, the garbage, and the slop all over the internet. I'll tell you one quick story. I've met Zhu Rongji when he was in Washington to visit Clinton. And I had the opportunity with Al Haig and Colin Powell and Jean Kirkpatrick to have dinner with Zhu Rongji, and he told this story about four elderly Chinese farmers who came into Beijing, and they, because on Saturday in Beijing, like Moscow in the old days, you could trade freely in fruit and vegetables. In fact, the only fresh produce you got in Moscow in the old days was on Saturday in the marketplace. And these old men brought their garlic into the marketplace of Beijing, and it started to rain. And they put their mat down in front of an internet store started by 3 graduate students from UCLA. And it started to rain. They wandered inside this internet store to see what was going on. And the young men talked the old men into putting their produce on the web. It's up there, still there, www.chinesegarlic.com. Within a few hours, they had orders from Chinese restaurants in Berlin, Rome, London, and probably Houston, Texas. Now, whether the anti-globalists, these young, fat, spoiled, economic students from Yale University who are pouring out of the university, all white, aren't they? You don't see Indian or third world kids demonstrating against globalism. They want into our market. It's spoiled. Excuse me for being a little bit over the top on this issue.
Go ahead.
I went to Seattle for the World Trade Organization. I went up there to represent, not the Bush administration, because I don't speak for him, but I represented the liberalization of trade that he is pursuing, albeit haphazardly at times. This isn't on tape, is it?
Yes, it is.
I get a call from Karl Rove.
You're on.
I don't worry about
Jack, I have to tell you,
robots.
you're being webcast. This is internet webcast.
Anyway, these kids are demonstrating against that which the rest of the world is in desperate need of. Trade, opportunity to sell freely in the marketplace. And I'm always surprised at being in Seattle with WTO. The kids that were arguing with me, they weren't black. They weren't brown. They weren't Latino or Hispanic. They certainly weren't from Africa or India. They were white, suburban, spoiled, middle-class kids taught by some professor that international capitalism and international trade is somehow going to hurt the third world. Nonsense. You cannot talk to an African leader today who doesn't want to open up trade with the United States of America. They want us to take down our barriers, stop our subsidies, and begin to promote that which all too many take for granted. That's a young man who wants to ask a question.
Okay.
Ask me what time it is, I tell you how to make a clock. Yep.
Is there
Oh, I'm sorry. Good.
Yeah, right.
Very commendable remarks.
Thank you, sir.
Always impressive. Wish you'd been president.
Thank you. From your lips.
No, the point I'd like to ask is that there's no question about the intensity of your passion. The question I have is the unfortunate failing of discipline within the capitalist sort of structure. Even our culture, which is based on entrepreneurship for the most part,
Right.
has been basically become extremely indebted. And we have a rising issue on a daily basis, not over the last 5 years, of competitiveness with the Chinese, of the Orient, the Far East, India, Pakistan, and you name it. So the question I have is that whereas I could justify the Marshall Plan as a way to kickstart a European country and unification, my question becomes, in this particular vein, as we vest our interest and our intellect and our passion and our experience, are we at some point, in fact, shooting ourselves in the foot while we see those other countries, which is true and fair
Yeah, fair enough.
in a capital comparative
question.
advantage sort of thing. So my question is, how do you view that? Because I do see all those advantages. I do not see the clash of cultures, as I agree with you completely,
Thank you.
knowing the intimacies of that area of the world. So how would you respond to that?
I would respond to you the same way I responded to my auto workers in Buffalo, New York. I was born in Southern California. My daddy and mother were Republican. I'm, as you can tell, a WASP. I go to Buffalo, New York. Herb Klein campaigned for me in Buffalo, New York. It's Catholic, it's labor, it's Democrat, it's left of center, and the most wonderful people on this earth, just like all of you in Houston. In other words, hardworking people, Polish, Italian, German, African American, and I'm their congressman. And I'm for free trade, and they're for protectionism. We don't want Toyota coming to the United States of America, Jack. What are you going to do about Toyota and Nissan and BMW And all these foreign automobile companies, Japan, remember the old, in the 70s and 80s, Japan Inc.? We got to run the United States the way the Japanese run MITI, Ministry of what? Trade and Industry. Right. Trade and Industry. So I get that in spades, and I'll tell you how I can only give you one answer. Hey, Mrs. or Mr. Auto Worker, your enemy is not Tokyo. Your enemy is not Toyota. Your enemy is not in Germany. Your enemy is not in Beijing. The enemy to your job and to your wages and your standard of living is in Washington, D.C., where they're overtaxing you, they're overtaxing your boss, they're overtaxing labor, they're overtaxing the investment of capital in your business that would make you more productive and create more trucks for you to drive, and maybe someday you could be a truck owner rather than just a truck driver or an auto mechanic. I was at the AFL-CIO convention in Buffalo, New York before the UAW. You have not seen a union. I was president of the Football Players Union for 5 years, so I'm very sympathetic. Ronnie Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild. So I went. They didn't think I would show up. And I get a question in the back room, Jack, we really like that idea of eliminating the capital gain tax in enterprise zones. And he said, what can I do to help you? An auto worker, a black auto worker in Buffalo, New York. I said, well, what did you like about my speech? He said, I love cutting tax rates. I love eliminating the capital gain tax. I said, why? Do you have any? He said, no, but someday I hope to. This is the mistake that the left is making in America. They see you as a worker in perpetuity instead of in being able to save and invest. I love Lincoln's quote about, he said, I don't believe in laws to prevent a man or woman from getting rich. I want every man, or he didn't say this. In 1860, they only talked about man. But today, and to be rightly correct and politically correct, men and women. He said, I don't believe in laws to prevent a man from getting rich. I want every man to get rich. I want the black man to get rich. That's why he got shot, by the way. I want him to be able to earn, save, and someday hire others to work for him. That, to me, is the true system. That's the greatest statement of entrepreneur capitalism I've ever heard. That speaks to my heart. And that auto worker, if he or she is approached as not just a worker, but a saver, a father, a husband, a potential businessman, I think you can turn American labor from the left, not to the right. And this is the nice thing about DeSoto. This is not left. It's not right. It's not right wing and left wing. Clinton loves this. Reagan loves it. George Bush, Dick Cheney, Charlie Rangel from Harlem. Al Sharpton loves Hernando de Soto. And those ideas are now gaining hold in Egypt. They can spread to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we can turn the Muslim world with a Muslim face. You can't change people's culture. MacArthur's greatest contribution was to keep the emperor and change the land system. Excuse me for going on and on and on.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to end, but we're going to take two more questions, and those will be the last questions. Gentleman here. Sonia, right here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ian Everhart. I'm with Hanson College here at Rice, and I was just wondering, what do you think are the prospects for some of those things you're talking about? You know, free trade, certainly it'll help the third world, but it'll probably decimate trade. Certainly we've seen that in textiles here in the United States and to some extent, and you know, it's politically not very popular. What do you think? South
Carolina.
Yes, for example, and what do you see as the you know, in reality, what are the prospects for that?
Yeah, the prospects are on the surface tough because of the very issue you pointed out. John Edwards cannot support more liberal trade in textiles and be from South, or is he from North Carolina? I can't remember. North Carolina.
He's North Carolina.
I'm sorry I brought that up.
Yeah, but he's born in South Carolina.
Yeah.
In North Carolina, yeah. That's right.
But the enemy, the same answer to the young man that asked the previous question, the enemy of the textile worker is in Washington, D.C. For instance, you can depreciate machinery for making finished textiles in the United States over, I don't know, 12 or 15 years. I don't know what the depreciation schedules are for machinery. Why shouldn't we expense all investment in new machinery and new equipment and new technology so that we can be more competitive with the world. We don't want to compete with the world in low value-added textiles. We do want to compete in high value-added textiles. And this country can compete with any country in the world if our regulatory apparatus, our tax regime, and our monetary policies are conducive to the type of savings and capital investments so necessary. I am fond of an old Austrian economist that I read when I was early on in my football career, Ludwig von Mises, who you probably have never heard of, but he was one of the left guard for Notre Dame. No, USC. Ludwig von Mises said, the ultimate prosperity of the worker depends on the amount of capital invested per capita. The greater the amount of capital invested per capita, the greater the output and productivity. And all these people are worried about productivity right now. That's a sign that there's savings that are going to be plowed back into economic production and growth. Did you have a question on the end? No. Did you have a question? Yeah, one question. One last question.
Okay.
That woman has been waiting.
No, there's one. The last question is here. The gentleman there.
Thank you very much.
I'll get yours too.
I second your opinion on the Clash of Civilizations.
Say it again.
I said I second your opinion on the Clash of Civilizations, the book by Samuel P. Huntington, in that nations from Nigeria to Indonesia, they're Muslim-populated, Muslim, they're also democratic. Now, my question is that, seeing your plan, I see that the United States has tried 26 times to build nations and has only been successful 4 times, including Germany and Japan. Now, with your plans for Iraq and Egypt, the difference here is that Japan and Germany had some sort of infrastructure at that point prior to the war. These people do not have the basic infrastructure for any economic success. How long is this plan supposed to be put in place, or how long will it take for it to actually take effect?
I asked Art Laffer one time, how long would it take for an incentive to be productive to take place? He said, Jack, how long would it take for you to bend over and pick up a $100 bill? Now, as soon as you think the reward is commensurate with the effort, the risk, things begin to happen. You can't build a steel mill overnight, but as soon as an entrepreneur decides to get off the sidelines and go into a business because he sees there's pacification, there's security, there's a reward commensurate with his risk and his effort, things will begin to happen, number one. Number two, with all due respect, you're a man of color. I'm not, so I respect your question immensely, but I disagree with the premise. In Iraq, you have an educated people. You have an infrastructure that was there. It is deteriorated. There are 2 pipelines for natural gas and oil from Iraq into Kuwait. There are people talking right now about pumping millions of dollars into refurbishing those pipelines. Kuwait needs natural gas. Iraq has it. Iraq needs natural gas, needs electricity. Kuwait has a power plant ready to go. Iraq has a very sophisticated judicial system. Some of it was implemented by the British. Some of it was indigenous. That can be resurrected. The Kurdish prime minister, with whom I had lunch last week, gave me a lot of hope that the Kurds, the Shia, and the Sunni can get together and form a federal structure of government, not exactly like the United States of America. We don't have to put an American face on this. We want it done with an Iraqi face. But with respect for Iraqi sovereignty, I want to share with you, though, they are business people just like any man or woman in this room. I'm highly optimistic. Hushang, don't you agree that Iraq had a very sophisticated infrastructure at one time, now deteriorated?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I remember that
I took advantage of you because when you were talking, he was kind of like that. And when I said that they had an infrastructure, he did that, so I was assured that I was I was unfair to you, young man.
This has not been rehearsed. I think we're going to have to close it off because we've been very generous with your time, and this has been terrific. I just want to tell you we do have a backstop here in Houston. If the Marshall Plan that you are so validly advocating in the Middle East doesn't work out, if all our efforts don't work out for peace, we're going to do some surgery out there. We have Dr. Denton Cooley we're going to send out. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Jack Kemp.
Thank you. Thank you.